Okay, everybody, you got your contract accepted. You're the seller, you're excited, you like what the net proceeds are going to be, and you're thinking to yourself, well, it's all good and it's all good now, right? We just got the contract signed and everything. Well, there's a little bit more to do now. In fact, now is day one. It's the day after you had a fully executed contract. So let's talk about day one. Number one, the buyer's agent is probably going to be calling your listing agent very soon to schedule an inspection. In the state of Arizona, the contract boilerplate says that you have 10 days to do your inspection period. That means there's 10 days in the contract stating that this is the time the buyer has to look at your home and send out a general inspector, perhaps more of a detailed inspector, maybe an HVAC inspector, a pool inspector, a roofer. They can pretty much go in that home and inspect anything they want. And the seller needs to make reasonable accommodations to allow the buyer to do those inspections. So the boilerplate of the contract says 10 days, but that doesn't mean the buyer can't ask for more days or they can ask for less days. But during that time frame is the time the buyer has to look at your property. Also, that's the timeline that the buyer has to submit any repair requests to the seller. In the state of Arizona, we have a document. It's called the BINSR, and that stands for Buyer Inspection Notice and Seller Response. That is a very important document, and that needs to be sent by the buyer during that due diligence period, that inspection period. So let's just say the inspection period's 10 days. They've sent out a general inspector. The buyer's paid that person with money to go inspect your house. And that inspector goes in there and they just look for hours and hours with all the things that could potentially be wrong with your house. And then they're going to give you a long report. And by the way, in the Arizona purchase contract, you have a right to see that report. So you should see the report. And in that report, it'll also state if there's electrical issues, plumbing issues. It should state safety issues. It'll probably have items in red that the inspector recommends be addressed immediately. There might be items in yellow that say proceed with caution or just monitor the situation. And then you might have green that everything looks good. So you also may have a termite report you're doing. You should get that in a separate document. You might be deciding to do a sewer scope. There's all kinds of different inspections out there. There's septic inspections. So roofer inspections, ancillary inspections. So that first inspection period is very vital. Now, once the buyer puts in the repair request to the seller in the state of Arizona, then that inspection period is over. If they submit it on day 8, day 9, day 5, whatever, after that, the buyer cannot come back and ask for anything else. They've submitted their requests. The seller then has 5 days to respond. They can respond and say, yeah, we'll fix everything. Or maybe we'll give you a credit in lieu of repairs. Or maybe they'll say, go pound sand. Their response could be any of those things. Now, after the seller responds, and they have 5 days to respond, guess how many days the buyer has to respond to their response? 5 days. So this inspection whole due diligence process could go on for a while, and it's one of the most contentious areas of the contract. In fact, as a seller, when you get the inspection report, about 50 to 60 pages telling you about all the little things that are wrong with your house, many sellers typically have an emotional response. And that emotional response is understandable. Somebody's coming in to pick your home apart. But typically sellers, when they maybe go to bed and they think about it and they get up and they realize, okay, these are real issues. The inspector is called out. And then they start to think about what are they willing to do with this negotiation. So your listing agent should be talking to you, listening to you, listening to your concerns, seeing if you want to make any kind of repairs, or would you rather give a credit in lieu? So everything you're telling your listing agent, they should be responding back to the buyer. So that's the whole process. The buyer will then decide if they want to continue or not based on your response. So it's a very fair process, and a good listing agent might be having several conversations with the buyer agent about this situation before anything goes into writing, because this is an important part of the issue of the contract. In fact, the repair process, the negotiation on repairs, can sometimes be the hardest part within a contract in Arizona. Then after that decision's made, typically the buyer will pull the trigger on ordering an appraisal. If there's a loan involved and you know that there's been a meeting of the minds with repairs, then the next step would be an appraisal. And that is where you should be asking your listing agent, your agent, to go to the property and meet the appraiser and justify the price of the home. This is where you as a seller should be giving information, capital improvements to the property, anything you've done to the property over the years that would be considered an added value into the home, because your listing agent's job is to justify the price that was agreed upon at the beginning. Now, let's say the house has been sold for $500,000 and the appraisal comes in at $490,000. In Arizona, the buyer has the right to ask the seller to come down to $490,000. That's the contingency on the appraisal. That's the protection that the buyer gets. Now, the buyer can certainly ask the seller to come down to the appraisal because the lender's not going to loan on more than that appraisal. They're not going to loan on a purchase price of $500 because it's only worth $490. But the seller doesn't have to come down to $490. They can say, no, the contract price is $500,000. And if they say no, that means the buyer is going to have to come in with an additional $10,000 in addition to their down payment, because the lender is not going to cover that additional $10,000. So the Arizona purchase contract heavily aids the buyer. The buyer has advantages in our purchase contract. The seller doesn't have to go down. And if the buyer refuses to move forward with the transaction, they can actually cancel using the appraisal contingency. So there are ways to get out of the contract if you're a buyer, if the seller does not want to come down to the appraisal. Finally, after the appraisal has been done and there's a meeting of the minds on the appraisal, then the seller will commence with fixing the home, fixing the repairs that they agreed to, or not if they didn't. And during that time, it's kind of a slower time in the transaction, but the buyer's going to be getting receipts from the seller showing that work has been done. And that's really important because that moves us right into the final closing process, which is important. The last week of the transaction, there's a lot of things that go on. But I just covered the inspection process in detail and the appraisal process in detail. I hope this helps you through your next transaction. Talk to you soon.